Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to wait a few minutes for other folks to join, but we'll get started in just a few minutes if you just hang tight. Thanks for being here. Hi, everyone. For those who just joined, we're going to get started in just a few minutes while we wait for others to join. Thanks for being here. And again, just one more time for people who just joined. We'll get started in just one more minute. Okay, great. I think we're going to get started now, and a few other people will just trickle in as they do. But hi, everyone. My name is Kate Henning, and I'm going to be the moderator for tonight's webinar. I grew up in Boston, and I now study health science and environmental studies at Northeastern University, and I'm currently working at Massachusetts Peace Action. So welcome to tonight's webinar about inequities in global access to COVID-19 vaccines, put together by Massachusetts Peace Action's Fund Healthcare Not Warfare campaign. The Fund Healthcare Not Warfare campaign includes nurses, physicians, biomedical researchers, single payer, universal healthcare advocates, educators, and lots of others who all agree that the bloated military budget is harming the well-being of our communities and families by diverting precious resources away from healthcare, public health, and pandemic response, and instead towards war, militarism, and corporatism. So our campaign works to cut the Pentagon budget and reinvest the funds in healthcare, public health, climate justice, and lots more. Right now, this reinvestment really must include funding for the production and distribution of enough COVID vaccines for every person in the world. Currently, 70% of people in wealthy countries are vaccinated, while only about 14% of people in low-income countries have received even a first dose of a COVID vaccine. And estimates for the cost of manufacturing and distributing enough vaccines for every person in the world fall somewhere between 25 and $70 billion, which really just means that at the highest estimate, supporting global access to COVID vaccines would cost less than 9% of this year's $778 billion US military budget. So our call for funding healthcare, not warfare, is really more important now than ever. And tonight, we are joined by three incredible panelists who will speak to this issue and discuss the causes and impacts the causes and impacts of and the solutions to ending vaccine apartheid. Before I introduce those speakers, I first wanted to thank Representative Lindsay Sabadosa of Northampton for being here. We really appreciate it so much. And I also just wanted to mention that one of the speakers for tonight was going to be Cambridge City Councilor Quinton Zondervan, who co-sponsored a resolution in 2020 calling for increased global collaboration, particularly between the United States and Cuba, to combat COVID-19. So he's been really heavily involved in local work relating to the topic of tonight's event. Unfortunately, Monday nights are the Cambridge City Council meetings, so Councilor Zondervan couldn't be here, but he did record his words to kick us off for the night. So I'm going to play his video recording to say hello and speak to everyone briefly, and then we'll get started with the actual speakers. So please let me know in the chat if you can't hear it, but I think it should be good to go.
Hi, my name is Quinton Zondervan. I'm a Cambridge City Councilor. and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very important discussion on global vaccine equity. As you're probably aware, COVID-19 is the first pandemic in human history that produced effective vaccines just 1 year after the first cases were diagnosed. Millions of lives undoubtedly have been saved by these rapid vaccine developments, including several vaccines independently developed in Cuba. However, as with most things in our very inequitable society, these vaccines were not equitably distributed, both within countries and globally. Over 6 million people have died from COVID-19 in just 2 years, and some estimates are as high as 18 million. And many of these deaths could have been prevented had the vaccine been more equitably and more rapidly distributed across the globe. About 57% of the world's population is considered fully vaccinated at this point, whereas that figure is 66% in the United States. And not all vaccines are equally effective, creating further inequity even among those who have received their shots. It does not have to be this way. Individual corporations and governments have made choices that resulted in and continue to perpetuate these inequities. But just as we've learned to innovate and develop and manufacture novel vaccines faster than ever before in human history, so too can we learn and innovate to distribute them more rapidly and more equitably across the globe to save lives and protect people's health and safety. And it starts with conversations like today, leading to global collaboration among those willing and able to promote vaccine equity. Here in Cambridge, I co-sponsored a policy order in 2020, recognizing the extraordinary achievements of the Cuban biopharma community and urging global cooperation. I wish you a fruitful and collaborative time together as you work out new ways to achieve vaccine equity across the globe.
Awesome, great. So I hope everyone appreciated Zondervan's words as much as I did and the work that he and the rest of Cambridge City Council have been doing to try to increase global access to COVID vaccines. As he said, to do this, global cooperation really is critical, and I'm excited about the discussion we're going to be having tonight. I'm now going to introduce our speakers. Each of them will present for about 8 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period with discussion at the end, so everyone here can engage with this conversation and ask questions. But yeah, first I'll introduce the speakers. We have here Brook Baker, a professor of law at Northeastern University School of Law. Professor Baker teaches disability discrimination law, negotiations, and a new course on human rights, intellectual property, and access to medicines. Professor Baker is an honorary research fellow at the University of KwaZuluNatal in Durban, South Africa. He is also a senior policy analyst for Health Gap and is actively engaged in campaigns for universal access to treatment, prevention, and care for people living with HIV and AIDS. More recently, he has been working on accelerating research on and equitable global access to vaccines, medicines, and diagnostics to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you, Professor Baker, for being here. I am also honored to say that we are joined by Dr. Rolando Perez-Rodriguez, who was born in Havana, Cuba, and is now the Director of Science and Innovation at BioCubaFarma, a state-run holding group of the biopharmaceutical industry in Cuba. In his career, Dr. Perez has been part of the National Institute of Oncology, the head of biochemistry department in Havana, and the research director of the Center of Molecular Immunology in Havana. In 2011, he was appointed as the vice president and deputy general manager of biotech pharmaceutical company in Beijing, which is a joint venture company of the Center of Molecular Immunology in Havana. In this role, he was a pioneer in the studies of epidermal growth factor receptor expression in human breast cancer and supervised several projects related to therapeutic cancer vaccines. And in his present role at BioCubaFarma, which produced one of Cuba's COVID vaccines, the Soberana vaccine, Dr. Perez has been involved in COVID vaccine research, production, and distribution. So thank you, Dr. Perez, for being here. We definitely have a lot to learn from you. And finally, I'm really excited to introduce Abdi Ahmed. He's our third speaker. Abdi was born in Somalia, Africa, and came to America, actually came to Cambridge, so local, as a teenager in 1992. After getting his Doctor of Pharmacy degree in 2003, he was recruited to work in Maine and has been there for 18 years now. He works as a pharmacist 4 days a week and spends much of the rest of his time as a community organizer with a group called Maine People's Alliance, and another organization that he formed called the New Mainers Alliance. This organizing work that he does focuses on civic engagement and education, access to healthcare, increasing the minimum wage, affordable housing, vaccine equity, and lots of other really important related issues. In 2019, Abdi started a clinic in Roxbury called the Community Caring Clinic, which is a behavioral health clinic that provides access to mental health care for low-income people, primarily immigrants, refugees, and their children. Here, he works to address trauma, increase social emotional skills, and improve access to healthcare. Once COVID hit 2 years ago, the clinic worked hard to help community members by offering things like virtual computer trainings, vaccine clinics, and other forms of support. Abdi has been working hard on the front lines of this pandemic and definitely has a lot to share with us tonight. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks to all of our three great speakers. And first we'll hear from Professor Baker. So go ahead.
So first of all, thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for this great turnout, which is really a sign of how seriously people are taking the pandemic, and it's just thrilling that people have come. So I'm going to quickly get into the presentation, and the first slide is a slide that shows that basically what we have right now in terms of vaccine access globally. And of course, what you can tell by this global map is that the countries with lots of green are the countries that have lots of vaccination per population, and the countries with lighter green or yellow have very little, and some of the ones that have no data are shown in gray. So you can kind of see a global representation of what we've come to call vaccine apartheid. This is a graph that dramatically demonstrates what Kate said earlier, which is that we have hugely disproportionate access between high income and upper middle income countries, which now have administered close to 2 doses per person in their countries, and low income countries where we have a tiny fraction of that kind of coverage, with lower middle income countries, roughly in between. But this is just a representation over time, and we can see how the disparity was, started high and has continued basically apace. We still have, relative degrees of vaccine apartheid and distribution that grossly disadvantage people in lower resource countries. Now, I think to understand why people are emphasizing the importance of sharing vaccines and basically the fruits of scientific research is partly because of the huge amount of federal and other government and private funding, charitable funding that has been devoted to vaccine development and COVID vaccine in particular. The NIH between 2000 and 2019 spent almost $17 billion on vaccine research, largely because private industry had retreated from vaccine research, and it was left to the public funding of research scientists, mainly in universities, to try to make up that gap. Coronavirus research was funded during this time period, but as you can see in the chart, the red line is the line for coronavirus related vaccine research, and it ebbed and flowed largely in response to the previous infections with MERS and SARS that we experienced earlier in this decade, this century rather. On top of that amount of funding, which historically set the groundwork for virtually all the vaccines that are currently in use, we also have had huge federal investments that have de-risked COVID vaccine research and development, their clinical trials, their expanded manufacturing capacity, and the development of needed supply chains. $19 billion went to vaccine developers, and another $2.5 billion went to contract manufacturers and suppliers of needed components of the vaccines. So this is just a long list of all the money that these corporations got. And this is the source that we relied on for this information. Now, what are the consequences of a research and development system and an ownership system that we have now in the biopharmaceutical industry? Well, I teach, one of the things I teach is intellectual property rights. And basically, countries around the world, almost all countries, grant what are called intellectual property rights to biopharmaceutical inventors. One form of protection is patents. Another form of protection is trade secrets and confidential information protections. And these protections allow the drug companies, the vaccine manufacturers, basically to have what are called exclusive rights to exclude competitors, and the right to essentially have monopoly control. One of the consequences of monopoly control is that the right holders can artificially restrict supply. So one of the things we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, even though we had brilliant scientific discovery, we had artificially restricted supply because the vaccine manufacturers were not willing to share their recipe with capable manufacturers globally. They were worried that their technology platforms might be copied and used more broadly, and particularly that was true for messenger RNA vaccines that were developed by Moderna and BioNTech Pfizer. And so they decided that they would rather have very tight control over manufacturing. With that artificially restricted supply, the initial focus was to supply rich country markets where they could charge higher prices. And they focused on internal and contract manufacturing capacity, but as I said before, restricted capacity in other companies in other regions of the world. They overestimated their supply capacity and were not able to deliver what they had promised. And thus we are left with the inadequate supplies that characterized most of 2021. A second consequence of their policies is high prices and profiteering. Now, we had a few companies that charged less, a cost-plus basis, Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, but others, including Pfizer and Moderna, have charged very high prices, in fact, as high as $37 per dose. So for a 2-dose course of treatment, almost $75. These companies have made enormous amounts of sales and therefore profits. Moderna earned $17.7 billion. Approximately $12 billion of that has been recognized to be profit over and above the cost of production and research and development. Pfizer earned $36.7 billion. And Pfizer has signaled that it intends to raise prices to as high as $150 to $175 a dose when the pandemic ends. What we've most experienced, we might say, is grossly inequitable distribution. If we had a fair and equitable distribution system, everyone everywhere in the world would have gotten vaccines on an equitable basis, with first vaccines going to the most vulnerable populations. We would have had adequate donor and domestic funding to strengthen health systems and develop vaccine delivery services. And we would have had a much quicker end to the pandemic. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. Instead, we had preferential and disproportionate supply to rich countries. We had low and middle income countries left behind. And as a result of the delays that were attributable to this inequitable distribution, at least twice as many people have died as needed. This vaccine apartheid is creating a risk of a prolonged and worse outcome to the pandemic. Variants arise in unvaccinated and untreated populations. Variants that do develop may bypass existing vaccine and natural immunity. And the continuing cycle of profiteering by vaccine manufacturers and vaccine nationalism by rich countries will be cycles of repeat return of increased number of COVID cases, hospitalizations, deaths, and economic disruption. So there was a very promising proposal put forth by South Africa and India in October of 2020, which basically demanded that there be a temporary waiver of intellectual property protections on all medical countermeasures, but most particularly vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, and that temporary waiver of all relevant intellectual property rights on COVID technologies would extend until the pandemic ended. 17 months later, despite widespread civil society and governmental support by over 100 countries, that waiver has not yet been adopted at the World Trade Organization. And instead, the Director General of the WTO, within the past 2 weeks, has developed a text which is highly favorable to the positions taken by the US, which was for a vaccine waiver only, and by the European Union, which did not want to give a waiver on anything except patents, and then would require use of what are called compulsory licensing mechanisms under the World TRIPS agreement. So we're at an impasse, unfortunately, on one of the promising initiatives by developing countries that would have brought us more immediate relief to increase the number of capable manufacturers who could bring vaccines to market and meet global need. I just want to mention one other promising development where I know we're going to hear about the Cuban vaccines in a bit too, which is another promising initiative, but this one is the World Health Organization Technology Transfer Hub, which has been set up in South Africa. Its basic motto is to reverse engineer the Moderna vaccine, which it's already done, and to simultaneously begin to develop an improved version of that vaccine and the basic underlying messenger RNA technology platform. And then it wants to share that on an equitable basis at this point to 13 other countries, but perhaps more in the future, under conditions that those new companies will also share any improvements back to the hub and to all the other spokes. So this is basically a form of South-South collaboration where companies and countries are experimenting with the idea of getting out from under the intellectual property shackles that the US government and European Union and other rich countries have imposed on the global South. And instead having more open source method of manufacture, a more distributed set of manufacturing facilities, and more equitable distribution of the resulting products, basically to develop the kind of self-sufficiency which will free them from the shackles of vaccine apartheid and monopoly control. So I will end there and hope be very willing to answer questions if need be.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll have time for questions after each of the speakers goes, if that's all right. But yeah, thank you for speaking about those connections between intellectual property protections and profit with this lack of global access to COVID vaccines. We're now going to hear from Dr. Perez. We'll learn about Cuba's efforts to address this issue and increase global access to vaccines, as well as just Cuba's successful vaccination program within the country itself. So Dr. Perez, pass it over to you.
I would like to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to share our experience with COVID-19 vaccine program in our country. You know, many people outside Cuba ask, how did Cuba develop 5 successful COVID-19 candidates? I have to say that currently we have 3 COVID vaccine that has obtained the emergency use authorization from the National Regulatory Agency in Cuba, and 2 other vaccine candidates are still in clinical development. There are 6 fundamental reasons that explain this result. First, Cuba has made a strong investment in biotechnology since the 1980s. It has given rise to a high-tech industry with both scientific and productive capacity in compliance with good manufacturing practice. BioCubaFarma, the holding group of biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry in Cuba, has a portfolio of 101 biopharmaceutical products in development, of which 32% are vaccines, preventive and therapeutic, and 75 of this portfolio are innovative products, of which there are 20 that are potentially first-in-class products. It means we really have a strong biotech input. In particular, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, 11 different vaccines were developed. Some of them protected by patent and with a pre-qualification certification by the World Health Organization. These vaccines use different platform technologies, widely validated in massive immunization programs. The capacities built years before and the experience accumulated contributed to the accelerated development of Cuban vaccine candidates for COVID-19. In addition, there is a national immunization program led by the Ministry of Public Health, in which the primary healthcare level participate, with a wide level of coverage and accessibility, and the capacity and experience of clinical trials with vaccines, both in the pediatric and the adult population. The country also has a strong national regulatory agency, which collaborate with the Pan American Health Organization. Our SECMEC, our national regulatory agency, established special provisions on the approval process for clinical trials and the authorization of emergency use, and accompany the industry in the development of vaccine candidates from the design, research, clinical development, and pharmacovigilance along large-scale medical use. Also proactive and conscious participation of the population, which has allowed the high level of coverage and the high rate of subjects vaccinated daily. The results is a consequence of the organization of Cuban society and one of the economic and social development models of our country. Science and innovation have become factors of transformation of the national culture, which has consequently brought about a change in the social perception of science and scientists. And finally, an organizational innovation was implemented based on a triangular model between the industry, the national regulatory agency, and the national health system that make it possible accelerate the project we have been developed during this pandemic. In essence, investment in science and innovation is a determining element of technological sovereignty, therefore of the response capacity in health emergency situation, not only for rich countries, but also for developing countries. The technological sovereignty is complemented by social determinants, which allow the concentration of material and human resources, the establishment of priorities, the contribution and commitment of society, which ultimately translate into the impact on health. A second question many people ask is, can Cuba contribute to help vaccinate other countries? Cuba has a potential capacity to produce tens of millions of doses of vaccine, currently limited by the supply of raw materials and the financial situation, both causes aggravated by the U.S. economic, commercial, and financial blockade against Cuba. Cuba has made and will make donations to the extent of his economic and financial possibilities. These donations have been made to countries expressing interest in receiving Cuban vaccines. Cuba offered doses of vaccine at solidarity price to the countries of the South that need it. To date, Cuba has exported doses of vaccine to countries like Iran, Venezuela, Vietnam, and Nicaragua. Currently, there are trading shares with more than 50 countries, many of them of low income. Cuba vaccine show effectiveness in controlling the Delta pandemic peak, and currently the booster dose campaign has made the Omicron pandemic peak less intense than in other countries. Cuba vaccine had the advantage of being very safe, and they do not need a cold chain below 0 degrees centigrade. BioCubaFarma has been in permanent contact with the PAHO and WHO representation in Havana for pre-qualification of the COVID-19 vaccines. It is our intention to obtain the pre-qualification for the vaccines in the year 2022. We continue working with the national regulatory agencies of those countries interested in acquiring Cuban vaccines. In particular, we are in the best position to collaborate with those countries with the lowest incomes in order to increase the level of vaccination coverage of their respective populations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perez. Thank you for speaking about Cuba's successful vaccination efforts. So many countries have a lot to learn from that experience, and also just about the limits that US policies have had on Cuba's ability to increase access in other countries. It's such an important effort, and it's yet another change that the United States can essentially make today to change the trajectory of global access to COVID vaccines. So really thank you. And I'm now going to pass it off to our final speaker, Abdi Ahmed. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you. I want to thank, first of all, for the organizers of this great event. First of all, actually, I want to address the impact of the global vaccine inequity. Is for real. And I will share you some personal information for tonight for the for a few minutes that I have. I live in Lewiston, Maine, in US, but also I have family members in Somalia, Kenya, who have actually I've been in touch with them daily during this past during the pandemic. Unfortunately, some of those family members did not make it during this pandemic because of the COVID. So I will share some of those personal information. For example, early to 2020, when pretty much I will say actually mid 2020, I had actually my uncle who actually stopped right before the COVID. Actually, he stopped by here in Maine. He visited. He went back home. I mean, before the closure, before actually for the ban of traveling. So he went back home in Africa. He stopped by and went back home. And right after he got home, he got actually tested COVID positive. And he called me, say, "Hey, Abdi, I got I tested positive for COVID-19." And and he said he was in Somalia. He said there's no vaccinations available to regular people, and also the hospital is overrun, and also the few vaccinations that actually came through to the WHO or other non-profit organizations are only given to the people that work for international NGOs. So the regular people from regular ordinary population are not accessible to those vaccines that needed to the Africa, especially in Kenya and Somalia. So, few days passed. I call him every morning, check on how he's doing. He said, pretty much, I'm gonna just do the best I can to make it home, to see what I could do. So he got his condition got worse day by day. So, finally we said, you need to get some help. So he was taken to ambulance to the local hospital, and there was not a bed available, and also there was no ventilator available. He needed actually to be on ventilator, and he was put on a waiting list, waiting to get a bed available. He never made it through, and he knew actually. He said that going to that ambulance, he said goodbye. I'm not gonna make it because I know that actually where I'm heading, there may not be a bed available, or there may not be oxygen available, and many people actually didn't even go to hospitals. They once they got COVID positive, once they test COVID positive, they stayed at home and pretty much pretty much they died with, with harm. And then guess what? It actually, it exposed to whole family members. For example, that family member uncle passed away, he had a lot of family members with him. So everybody got tested. Everybody was around him, trying to help him out. Everybody get tested, get tested positive. So luckily, he was the only one who passed away. Everybody else pretty much was, younger and, didn't pass out. But so one of the things that I'll share with you tonight is actually in terms of the global effects in inequity in Africa. It is so for real that actually many actually of when the governments in Africa, they closed down for people moving around, they actually did it. They said no one can go out pretty much, they shut down actually everything. When they shut down everything, most people actually in Africa, they go make living by going to work every day. So the government did not have resources to provide, people they, population, people they ask that, they close everything, they close the markets, they close everything down, they shut down. So they said everybody should stay home, you cannot come out. And people are like, hey, and they're not providing actually food, they're not providing actually necessary needs that people need. So that was actually a lot of people actually have a really tough time to, to survive. And it was a very chaos because some of those governments in, in Somalia and Kenya that I'm specifically I'm talking about, they were never prepared for in terms of this pandemic and do not know what to do. In terms of the, the rich countries, they turn around and ask for help. And, they didn't get enough vaccination. They did not get help that they need. They shared information, how many people are dying every day in the US, Europe, and most of those countries that we're at, we were very, most of us had our first doses, or second doses, while the people in, in East Africa that I'm talking about do not even have the first dose. And the sad part is that actually some of those, the embassies from the Western countries, all this stuff has been get vaccinated, first dose, second dose. And while actually the local population actually don't even have access to vaccinations. So and WHO actually tried to help, but because of global fights between with the rich countries, couldn't do much, could not provide enough doses to poor countries in Africa. So we lost many lives, just sadly in Africa. And the numbers actually, in terms of you ask, especially for Kenya, Somalia, how many people died in the past 2 years for COVID? They have no numbers because a lot of people stay home, did not even make it because did not make it to the hospital. So the numbers actually don't even have correct numbers to share with the WHO. How many people that they could only tell you people that make it to the hospital, who died in the hospital, but people who passed away during the homes, those are not unaccountable. And it is still happening right now. While here in America we are doing a booster shot, a third shot, fourth shot. Some people maybe, there are people in Africa right now who have not had the first shot yet. So and that is still happening. And even and the few shots that make it out to there, usually the government officials will get it. Pretty much their families. So the ordinary people will not get those shots at all. So we hope. With the information that that especially other vaccines that are available, such as Cuban vaccines, somehow those vaccines even do not make it to Africa because it's all about global control. Is for manufacturers. So there's really major disparity in terms of vaccinations in Africa, and especially COVID. So I would definitely hang around and ask any questions that actually audience that has in terms of in Africa, especially in Somalia. And we would, believe it or not, family members will call and ask if there's any ways actually that we could share some information. One of the thing, actually great thing that we've done is to share information about actually education. So we run actually webinars, Zoom links to educate people in Somalia, in Kenya, about basic information, how to actually social distance themselves, and also how to protect their family and themselves. And it was very difficult to actually to do those seminars and webinars to share with them because of how people live. It was a very if a family member actually is dying, everybody else have to be there to support that person. So it is just cultural differences. It was huge. It was actually all the actual social distance that we would here in America. We had that we were educating people. In Africa, that was not working because of people like, hey, either way, we're gonna die for this, so we are for it. So whoever gets it, they're ready to die. They know that actually either they'll make it or they will also they'll die. Also, a lot of people and locally they try to use a lot of herbals. A lot of people actually that was the only solution they turn on. A lot of people were using a lot of herbals, a lot actually to treat themselves because that's the only thing they didn't have no access to vaccinations. So a lot of people used the local herbal stuff that green tea. It's one of them actually that was high. Vitamin D was a lot of things that people using. Ginger. So mixing a lot of different things. People try and use to see if they could actually if that would help out. So that's pretty much all I could share with you guys tonight. And if anyone has questions, I'll feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdi. Thank you for sharing your own personal experience and your expertise and for really demonstrating what the actual cruel, dangerous human impacts of the global vaccine inequity that we've been talking about tonight are in real life. I really appreciate it. I'm sure everyone here does as well. We are going to move on to a period for audience members to ask questions, but just briefly before we do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a campaign for global access to COVID vaccines that I've been part of, very relevant to what we've been talking about tonight. As we've learned, there are quite a few actions that the US government and pharmaceutical companies can take right now to increase global access to COVID vaccines. And here in Massachusetts, we have a broad coalition that is specifically targeting Moderna, which is headquartered, again, right here in Cambridge, and one of the worst actors in putting profit before ending COVID. So Moderna is refusing to share vaccine technology with over 100 companies in low and middle income countries who are already capable and ready to produce vaccines. This is what Professor Baker was talking about before, and this has led to a staggering loss of human life and the spread of dangerous new variants worldwide. But we can end this pandemic by raising our voices and putting public pressure on Moderna to share the vaccine recipe. So on April 28th, hundreds of us are going to rally outside of Moderna's headquarters on the day of their shareholders meeting to demand that they share their vaccine technology with the world. And by adding immense public pressure and by spreading the truth about Moderna's actual role in this pandemic, we believe that this can and will be the action that changes the course of this 2-year vaccine equity campaign. We would love all of you to join us outside of Moderna on the 28th. And if you or your organization are interested in learning more, attending, or helping us to plan, definitely please sign this form that I'm going to put in the chat. The speakers tonight have really showed us what needs to be changed. And now it's kind of up to us to make that change. And I see April 28th as a really critical moment in that fight. So I've put the link in the chat, but now I'm going to move on to question and answer so we can hear more from these speakers. They have a lot to share. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat or raise your virtual Zoom hand and we'll make sure we get to you. Louise. Oh, you're muted.
Better. My name is Louise Coleman. I live in Cambridge. I work with Massachusetts Peace Action, but I also work globally with people in quite a few different countries on animal welfare issues. And I just wanted to say thank you to a young person I know in Argentina who, even though he had COVID and they didn't have access to vaccinations, he's on the call tonight, continued his work. And I just wanted to say that I admire his perseverance and also that of everyone in the world who keeps struggling to keep doing what they can do to make the world better, even though things are really awful. So that's it.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, and I know Nico might be on the call, and if he is, thanks, Nico, for coming.
Thank you.
I'll pause to see if there are any other questions that people have.
There must be.
That's what I'm thinking. I have a lot of questions on my own.
Kate, would you put the website or in the chat how to get more information about the Moderna action? Put that in the chat so people could share it with others.
Yes, definitely. I'll do that right now. And looks like Mary has her hand raised. Oh, Mary, I think you're muted if you're speaking.
I am muted. Sorry, I am muted. I'm also kind of shadowed. You know, as I was listening to Brook Baker and watching his presentation in particular, I was wondering what Rolando Perez thinks of that. Not thinks of the presentation, but what response he would have to some of the points that were being made. Because, you know, I'm here in Havana and I can attest to how very different the attitude and the perception is. And I know that when you're sitting in the United States, it feels like that's most of reality. You know, those vaccinations and that way of going about healthcare and so forth and so on. And so I'm curious to know what Dr. Perez would want to say in response to what Brook Baker presented.
Okay, you know, from my point of view, the problem or to solve that problem is just not a technological problem. You are fighting as a social movement. You are trying to do a very beautiful, I see, action for the for people. But we have to have an integral approach. It's not just a technology transfer. What we need organization of the health system in different low-income countries. We need to help them. We have to prepare a campaign. It's not just to have, we have to provide the people the reason why it is important, the vaccination. You know, for example, Cuba is one of the countries with very low rate of people that refuse to have the shot, to have the vaccination, and that's why we have maybe a long tradition of vaccination program in our country. We have a health system that is strong in the primary care level, and the scientists has made a big effort to communicate and explain the people.
Thank you, Dr. Perez. I think we got lucky and heard the last bit of your.
What we need vaccine. So what I try to say, a real comprehensive vaccination program success. You understand me?
Yep, we heard you. You just cut off at the very end, but I think we pretty much got the majority of what you said. So thanks so much. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we got your message. Thank you so much. I see a hand from Mohammed.
Hi, hi everyone. Thank you for having this webinar. It's really important. And thanks for the speakers for sharing their this great information with us, and Abdishfata especially sharing personal story that's really touching. My question is, how is the war in Ukraine impacting the the global vaccine process and this campaign particularly?
Thank you. That's a great question. Do any of the panelists want to answer first?
Well, I work with activists in Ukraine, and I've heard some feedback from people. Obviously, the entire health system in Ukraine is fractured. We've had dozens of hospitals targeted. We have millions of people displaced, both internally and leaving the country. We have what health services there are now diverted largely to caring to the wounded, people wounded in war. So like virtually everything else, maternal health, child health, sexual and reproductive health, tuberculosis, all of those programs are fractured by the war, as is COVID. There's a humanitarian buffer that's being deployed by the COVAX facility. It's run by Gavi and part of the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator that will try to contribute to the sustainability of vaccine supplies. But you can imagine that the delivery and to populations that keep running to shelters is terribly fractured. And of course, people are exposed to greater risk of transmission just because of the congregate circumstances in which people have to, travel to leave the country and then where they end up. So it's a hot mess. And as a practical matter, there's limits to what can be done globally to help rectify the impact of war on health delivery.
Great, thank you. And yeah, Jonathan, I see you have your hand raised.
Professor Baker described the failure of the World Trade Organization to respond to the call from South Africa to put a waiver on vaccines. We're not surprised, of course, the World Trade Organization is not responsible to voters, to citizens anywhere, right? It represents generally the interest of corporations. So the patent laws in the United States are written by the United States Congress. And probably we need some initiative in the Congress. We need to find some champions in the Congress. That would be the place where you would pass, amendments or modifications or waivers saying, nope, no patent protection for pandemics of a certain impact. And Kate, since you go to the meetings of the Free the Vaccine group, maybe you could raise in there the need for some kind of congressional initiative. Now, unfortunately, the most powerful lobby in the U.S., the military-industrial complex, but the second most powerful lobby is the pharmaceutical biotechnology lobby. So that's a very tough fight. But if it's not raised, people don't even realize that, patent law, you can make a law saying that, gene sequences can be patented. And you can also make a law saying, nope, these things are outside the realm of patent protection. Jefferson wrote the patent laws, the first ones, and he was very clear that they were only for the temporary protection of inventors and not to allow what's happened, monopoly control over the product. So we need some congressional campaign, not only for action, but as a vehicle for educating people that we don't have to allow corporations monopoly control over things like vaccine, which depend on knowledge gained by thousands and thousands of scientists all over the country and all over the world.
Thanks, Jonathan. yeah, I think that plays a lot into how like Moderna and Pfizer and other pharma companies have also just been seen as heroes during this pandemic because they technically have produced the vaccines, but there's definitely another story to be told. I see, Lisa, you have your hand up. You can go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I have no faith or confidence in a system like ours at the moment that is privatizing everything and making profits on the healthcare of people and where our own health is. I mean, they've just taken away funding for COVID testing here in Pennsylvania, which means that even if people are exposed to these COVIDs, they won't even, I mean, they now have to pay themselves to find out and find a way to even get that. So what I want to raise is the Cuban vaccines. I really feel that Cuba has demonstrated an internationalism that over the years and has many international doctors already in many countries where they don't even have healthcare systems to provide vaccines, even if you had them. And so I think part of what we do, you know, I had lunch with my congressman the other day, and he said, forget Congress. He said, we can't get Republicans to support anything. We're not going to get an infrastructure bill. We're not going to get any of the legacy stuff we want. You know, we're going to lose in the midterms. And so, you know, don't spin your wheels there. So all I'm saying is, it seems to me that part of our campaign should really be doing everything to make it possible for the Cuban vaccines, which are effective, don't require the refrigeration and all of the special care that are as effective as anything else that we know on the market, to get the World Health Organization to whatever they do, so that these vaccines can be acknowledged, and look toward a campaign to help the poor of the world, with whom these Moderna and Pfizer are not going to make a huge profit like they have in our country, to make sure that the Cubans are able to do what the Cubans always do, which is go in and serve humanity. So I just feel that I'm very honored that we have a Cuban on this call this evening. I'd like to send my deepest respects for a country that is prioritizing healthcare and has done such a remarkable job of vaccinating its own people. I want to thank all of the people in this country that helped provide the syringes, which the US policy wouldn't even allow Cubans to save their lives by allowing syringes to go. We had to have a major campaign on that, which luckily we have been, I believe, successful at. So all I'm saying is, this is a bigger problem than locally. I think Moderna, my vaccines are Moderna. I think perhaps we should start a campaign where all of us who have been vaccinated by Moderna make a call that these vaccines be made public. But the whole tendency to privatize everything, commoditize everything, you know, isn't going to change just because it's the right thing to do. But the Cubans do offer an alternative, and I'd just like to make sure that we include solidarity with Cuba and assisting them in any ways that we're able to really help humanity. Thank you.
Can I just ask, who's your congressperson that you were referring to?
Yeah, Congressman Michael Doyle here in Pennsylvania has been remarkable on, I mean, he's been in the Congress 28 years.
Wow.
He's been remarkable on everything, but progressive people, we're losing a lot of people right now, and he's retiring this year also. We have all new incoming people, but yeah, I mean, he's been very straightforward with me, and I appreciate his candor.
Right.
In not spinning wheels and giving ideas. He also suggested that we really work to not spend a lot of time trying to move Congress, but actually just go after, like, you know, Biden and people, just somebody who actually can, by executive order, could try to do at least some things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. And I think we can finish with a question that definitely relates to that was in the chat. This one is for you, Dr. Perez, asking about how the US blockade inhibits Cuba's ability to produce vaccines.
No,
Go ahead.
Fast. You know, many companies in the world, because of this embargo in Cuba or blockade, cannot sell product to us, because if they have, for example, a component of the product that is from US, they cannot do it. And many of big industry suppliers, they cannot offer to us directly the product. Sometimes we have to go through different like a change, and that increases a lot the price. You cannot buy directly to the producers. You have to buy to other companies. And also, even if they want to send you the product, we have very hard situation to find the how to say, because of the financial blockade. Also, the banks don't want to work with Cuba because they have the pressure from US. So we can. It's difficult to find the pathway to make the payment, or even after we export some products, we have difficult to get the money back to Cuba, or to get the money to Cuba, because it's a problem to find banks that want to make operation with our banks in Cuba. So it's a real, we have a lot of examples that makes so difficult to really find the raw material, the supply, and even the financial operations. So currently are very, very difficult for us to pay, or to get our the money when we export some of the vaccine. For example, now if we want to produce more vaccines, we need to buy more raw material. So it's a really difficult situation for us. Very, very hard. I would like to say, concerning the campaign, I would like to stress that in Cuba, one of the facts that make a successful campaign was the vaccination of pediatric population. That make a real high impact in the way we can control the transmission, not just the severe disease, but also transmission. So I really think that I recommend that people study our experience, because vaccination of pediatric population is determinant to really control the transmission of the disease.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perez. At this point, it's 8:03, so I think we'll finish off here, although there's a lot more to say for sure. So again, if you're interested at all, I'd suggest you fill out that form I put in the chat. But also, I see Professor Baker is leaving. I'm reading them right now. Okay, yeah, also very important comments in the chat. But thank you, Professor Baker, Dr. Perez, and to Abdi for being here tonight and sharing all of your experience and expertise with us. And thanks everyone for those questions and discussion. I learned a lot, and yeah, I'm just grateful for everyone. Thanks for being here, and have a good night.
Thank you.